By late 1944, Japan's strategic position in the Pacific had deteriorated beyond recovery.
Naval defeat, loss of air superiority, and the steady contraction of Japan's defensive perimeter had removed the possibility of conventional operational maneuver. In this environment, Japanese leadership faced a narrowing set of options for continuing the war. The emergence of organized suicide air attacks, commonly known as kamikaze operations, was a response to this strategic collapse, not an expression of confidence or renewed capability. Kamikaze operations were conceived within a specific institutional and material context. Japan no longer possessed the trained pilots, fuel reserves, or aircraft production capacity required for sustained conventional air operations. At the same time, American naval power had become the decisive instrument of the Pacific War, enabling amphibious assaults, logistical sustainment, and air dominance across vast distances. Japanese planners identified Allied naval forces as the critical center of gravity they could still influence. The strategic logic behind kamikaze attacks was straightforward. By converting aircraft into guided weapons, Japan sought to bypass American advantages in training, radar, and air defense. The goal was not air superiority, but attrition. Specifically, the infliction of losses severe enough to disrupt operations, erode American political will, or force reconsideration of invasion plans. These attacks were intended to impose cost disproportionate to the resources expended. However, while kamikaze operations achieved notable tactical effects, they failed to produce meaningful strategic outcomes. American naval operations continued. Amphibious campaigns advanced. Industrial output and replacement capacity absorbed losses faster than they were inflicted. The gap between tactical damage and strategic influence remained unclosed.
The failure of kamikaze operations was not rooted in lack of sacrifice or determination. It was rooted in structural realities, industrial imbalance, defensive adaptation, and the inability of attrition alone to alter strategic decision-making in a war already decided by production and control of the sea. Understanding why kamikaze operations failed strategically requires separating their emotional and symbolic impact from their actual effect on the war's conduct. It requires examining how and why the attacks were employed, what they achieved in measurable terms, and why those achievements could not translate into strategic leverage. Kamikaze operations did not emerge spontaneously, nor were they the product of irrational fanaticism detached from military logic. They were the result of a specific strategic crisis confronting Japan in the latter stages of the Pacific War. By the autumn of 1944, Japan's ability to wage conventional air and naval warfare had effectively collapsed. The decision to institutionalize suicide attacks represented an attempt to extract remaining military value from a system already in irreversible decline. The material context was decisive. Japanese aircraft production continued, but pilot quality had deteriorated sharply. Training programs were compressed, fuel shortages limited flight hours, and attrition among experienced aircrew could not be replaced. Conventional air operations against American forces increasingly resulted in catastrophic loss ratios. Each sortie consumed aircraft, fuel, and pilots without measurable operational gain. At the same time, American naval forces had become the central operational enabler of the war. Carrier task forces provided air superiority, amphibious lift, logistics, and command and control across the Pacific. Japanese leadership correctly identified these naval formations as the critical vulnerability they could still influence.
However, they lacked the means to challenge them symmetrically. Kamikaze operations were conceived as a doctrinal workaround to this imbalance. By deliberately sacrificing pilots and aircraft in direct impact attacks, Japanese planners sought to bypass American advantages in radar, interception, and pilot training. Aircraft would no longer be platforms for sustained combat, but delivery mechanisms for explosives. Accuracy would be achieved through collision rather than fire control. The concept was formalized during preparations for the defense of the Philippines. In October of 1944, organized suicide attack units were established under naval authority. This was not an act of desperation by isolated commanders, but a sanctioned operational policy approved at senior levels. The expectation was that concentrated attacks against Allied shipping could impose losses severe enough to delay operations and alter American planning assumptions. Japanese planners calculated that even a small number of successful strikes could have disproportionate effects. Damage to aircraft carriers, transports, or logistics vessels might disrupt amphibious timetables, reduce air cover, or force redeployment of forces. In theory, this disruption could create operational pauses that Japan could exploit diplomatically or militarily. However, these calculations rested on assumptions that did not hold at the strategic level. American industrial capacity and shipbuilding output dwarfed Japanese estimates. Damage to individual ships rarely translated into operational paralysis. Even sunk vessels could often be replaced faster than Japan could generate new attack aircraft. Moreover, American naval doctrine adapted rapidly. Defensive measures were improved, radar coverage expanded, combat air patrols intensified, and damage control procedures refined. While kamikaze attacks increased immediate danger and inflicted casualties, they did not negate American defensive systems.
Instead, they were absorbed into an increasingly resilient operational framework. A critical limitation of kamikaze operations was their inefficiency as a strategic tool. Each successful hit required the irreversible expenditure of aircraft and pilot. Japan's remaining air strength was consumed rapidly, leaving no reserve for sustained influence. Attrition, rather than concentration, became the dominant dynamic, one that overwhelmingly favored the United States. Equally important was the absence of strategic follow-through. Kamikaze attacks were not integrated into a broader operational plan capable of exploiting temporary disruption. There was no credible Japanese maneuver capability, no reserve fleet, and no air force able to capitalize on damaged Allied formations. Tactical success occurred in isolation, without operational exploitation. The institutionalization of kamikaze operations also reflected internal constraints within Japanese command culture. Alternative strategies, such as withdrawal, selective engagement, or force preservation, were politically and culturally unacceptable. The suicide attack offered a way to continue fighting without acknowledging strategic defeat. In this sense, kamikaze operations served an internal psychological and institutional function as much as a military one. By the end of 1944, kamikaze attacks had become a regular feature of Japanese defense, particularly in areas where American amphibious operations were expected. Their use expanded not because they were strategically effective, but because other options had vanished. They represented the final adaptation of a system no longer capable of conventional war. Part 1 establishes a central analytical point. Kamikaze operations were not irrational, but they were structurally incapable of strategic success. They addressed tactical symptoms, difficulty penetrating American defenses, without altering the underlying determinants of the war: industrial capacity, sea control, and operational depth. In the following part, the analysis will examine what kamikaze attacks actually achieved in measurable terms: ship losses, casualties, and operational disruption, and why those results failed to translate into strategic leverage despite their immediate impact. The measurable effects of kamikaze operations must be assessed at the level where they appeared most effective: tactical damage and immediate disruption. During late 1944 and early 1945, suicide attacks inflicted visible losses on Allied naval forces, particularly during large-scale amphibious operations. These results created a perception, both at the time and in later memory, that kamikaze attacks posed a serious strategic threat. A closer examination of outcomes, however, shows that tactical damage did not translate into sustained operational or strategic effect. The first large-scale employment of organized kamikaze units occurred during the campaign associated with the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Japanese aircraft penetrated Allied defenses and struck a number of ships, including escort carriers and destroyers. Several vessels were sunk, others damaged, and casualties among naval crews were significant. From a tactical standpoint, these attacks demonstrated that direct impact methods could overcome radar, fighter interception, and anti-aircraft fire with a higher probability of hit than conventional bombing. However, the operational consequences were limited. Despite losses, Allied naval formations maintained coherence and continued supporting ground operations without interruption. Carrier air operations resumed quickly, amphibious landings proceeded on schedule, and logistical flow was not meaningfully disrupted. The U.S. Navy's layered defense, combat air patrols, radar pickets, and decentralized damage control proved capable of absorbing losses without systemic failure. This pattern repeated itself during subsequent campaigns. Kamikaze attacks imposed localized damage but failed to create cascading effects. Ships damaged but not sunk were often repaired and returned to service. Even when vessels were lost, replacements were available from a shipbuilding program operating at a scale Japan could not match. The destruction of individual units did not equate to degradation of fleet capability. The concentration of kamikaze attacks increased during the battle for Okinawa, where Japanese planners viewed Allied naval forces as both exposed and essential. Over an extended period, Allied ships faced sustained suicide air assault. Losses mounted, and the psychological strain on crews was severe. Yet the operational outcome remained unchanged. Naval gunfire, air support, and logistical sustainment continued throughout the campaign. The invasion was not delayed, and operational tempo was maintained. One reason for this resilience lay in American industrial and organizational capacity. Damage control doctrine emphasized rapid containment and redundancy. Crews were trained to fight fires, control flooding, and restore combat capability under extreme conditions. Even heavily damaged ships often remained operational long enough to withdraw for repair. The system was designed to function under attrition, and kamikaze attacks did not exceed its tolerance. Another limiting factor was the inefficiency of the kamikaze approach. While hit probability was higher than that of conventional bombing, each attack consumed an aircraft and pilot irreversibly. Japan lacked the capacity to sustain this expenditure over time. As attacks continued, aircraft quality declined, pilot training deteriorated further, and coordination suffered. The pool of available attackers diminished faster than the ability of Allied forces to adapt. Allied adaptation further reduced effectiveness. Radar coverage expanded, early warning improved, and fighter interception was pushed farther from the fleet. Anti-aircraft tactics evolved, and ships were reorganized into mutually supporting formations. The introduction of radar picket ships extended detection range, reducing surprise. Although these measures did not eliminate the threat, they reduced the likelihood that individual attacks would achieve high-value results. Crucially, kamikaze attacks lacked operational integration. Damage inflicted on ships was not followed by exploitation. There were no Japanese reserve forces capable of taking advantage of temporary disruption. No fleet maneuver followed successful strikes. No air offensive exploited gaps in coverage. Tactical success remained isolated, disconnected from any broader operational sequence. Japanese planners had hoped that cumulative losses would force American commanders to reconsider invasion timelines or operational objectives. This assumption underestimated the relationship between loss and decision-making in an industrial war. American strategy was not calibrated to avoid casualties at all costs, but to achieve objectives within acceptable loss parameters. Kamikaze attacks increased losses, but not beyond thresholds that would compel strategic reconsideration. The disparity in replacement capacity was decisive. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, and support vessels lost to kamikaze attacks represented a small fraction of total Allied strength. Replacement ships entered service faster than Japanese forces could mount new attacks. The attritional exchange overwhelmingly favored the side with industrial depth, regardless of tactical innovation. From a strategic perspective, The key failure of kamikaze operations in this phase was proportionality. The cost imposed on the attacker was real, but the cost to the defender was catastrophic and irreversible. Japan traded its remaining air power for incremental damage that did not alter operational outcomes. Each successful strike reduced future attack potential more than it reduced Allied capability. Part 2 therefore clarifies a central point. Kamikaze operations succeeded tactically, but failed operationally. They demonstrated a method for penetrating defenses, but not a means for changing the course of campaigns. The attacks inflicted pain without leverage, loss without disruption, and sacrifice without strategic return. In the next part, the analysis will examine why Japanese leadership continued to expand kamikaze operations despite these limitations, focusing on institutional pressure, command culture, and the absence of viable alternatives rather than battlefield effectiveness alone. The continued expansion of kamikaze operations, despite their limited strategic effect, can only be understood by examining the institutional and cultural dynamics within Japanese command during the final phase of the war. This phase shifts the analysis away from battlefield outcomes and toward decision-making under conditions of strategic collapse. Kamikaze operations persisted not because they worked strategically, but because alternative courses of action had become institutionally and politically unattainable. By early 1945, Japanese leadership faced a closed decision space. Conventional military options had been exhausted. The Imperial Navy no longer possessed a viable fleet. Fuel shortages constrained training and movement, and air power existed largely on paper rather than as an effective operational instrument. Under these conditions, strategic adaptation did not mean choosing the best option. It meant choosing among the few options that remained acceptable within the system. Within Japanese military culture, surrender, operational withdrawal, or force preservation were not viewed as neutral military choices. They carried political, ideological, and moral consequences that senior leaders were unwilling or unable to accept. Kamikaze operations offered a way to continue fighting without formally acknowledging defeat. They transformed strategic failure into a narrative of resistance and sacrifice, preserving internal cohesion even as external prospects vanished. This institutional function was critical. Kamikaze attacks demonstrated action in a situation where inaction was unacceptable. They provided visible proof that Japan was still inflicting losses, still contesting Allied advance, and still exercising agency. From the perspective of Japanese leadership, the psychological and political value of continued resistance outweighed the operational inefficiency of the method. Command responsibility for kamikaze operations was diffused rather than centralized. Once authorized at senior levels, implementation was delegated to local commanders who faced intense pressure to demonstrate effectiveness. Success was measured in damage reports and claims rather than strategic outcomes. This reinforced a feedback loop in which tactical hits justified further commitment, even when cumulative results failed to alter the strategic balance. The absence of a clear metric for strategic success further enabled persistence. Japanese planners lacked reliable intelligence on Allied industrial capacity, repair timelines, and replacement rates. Damage reports were often interpreted optimistically, reinforcing the belief that sustained attacks might eventually produce decisive disruption. In reality, Allied systems absorbed losses far more effectively than Japanese assessments allowed. Kamikaze operations also aligned with the broader defensive doctrine emerging across Japanese forces. As seen in ground campaigns, particularly on island defenses, Japanese strategy increasingly emphasized endurance and cost imposition rather than victory. Suicide air attacks were the aerial counterpart of defense in depth on land. Both sought to delay, exhaust, and psychologically burden the attacker rather than defeat them outright. This alignment created internal consistency. Kamikaze operations were not an aberration within Japanese strategy. They were an extension of it. The same logic that justified prolonged resistance on isolated islands
justified the sacrifice of pilots in air attacks. In both cases, success was defined by duration and cost, not by outcome. Another factor sustaining kamikaze operations was the erosion of professional military judgment under prolonged crisis. As experienced commanders and aviators were lost, decision-making increasingly reflected institutional momentum rather than critical reassessment. Younger officers, socialized into a culture of sacrifice and obedience, were less likely to challenge assumptions or propose alternatives. The organizational capacity for strategic self-correction diminished over time. Importantly, kamikaze operations did not face meaningful internal opposition once institutionalized. The moral framing of the attacks insulated them from critique. Questioning their effectiveness risked appearing disloyal or defeatist. As a result, debate over cost versus benefit was suppressed, and continuation became the default. From an analytical standpoint, this phase highlights a key reason for strategic failure: persistence divorced from effect. Kamikaze operations continued because they fulfilled internal requirements, demonstrating resistance, maintaining morale, and conforming to ideological expectations, even as they failed to influence external outcomes. Strategic logic was subordinated to institutional survival. The American response inadvertently reinforced this dynamic.
Public acknowledgement of kamikaze danger, combined with visible damage and casualties, validated Japanese perceptions of effectiveness. While these acknowledgements reflected transparency and morale management within Allied forces, they also fed Japanese optimism regarding impact. The asymmetry of information allowed belief to persist in the absence of corroborating strategic results. Part 3 therefore explains why kamikaze operations expanded rather than contracted as Japan's situation worsened. They were sustained not by success, but by the lack of alternatives that were acceptable within Japanese command culture. Once adopted, they became self-justifying, insulated from strategic evaluation by ideology, institutional pressure, and incomplete information. In the next part, the analysis will examine the interaction between kamikaze operations and American adaptation, focusing on how Allied defensive systems evolved and why this adaptation further eroded any remaining strategic potential of suicide attacks, even as their use intensified. The strategic failure of kamikaze operations became increasingly pronounced as American forces adapted their defensive systems. This phase examines how Allied learning, organizational depth, and technological integration reduced the effectiveness of suicide attacks over time, transforming a dangerous tactical threat into a manageable, if still lethal, component of naval warfare. The interaction between Japanese persistence and American adaptation reveals why kamikaze operations could not generate cumulative strategic leverage. American naval defense against air attack was not static. Early encounters exposed vulnerabilities, but they also provided data. Radar detection ranges, fighter interception timelines, and shipboard fire control procedures were continuously refined. The response was systemic rather than episodic. Adjustments were implemented across fleets, not limited to individual ships or task groups.
This institutional capacity for rapid learning proved decisive. A central element of adaptation was the expansion of layered defense. Early warning was extended outward through radar-equipped ships, positioned ahead of main formations. Combat air patrols were restructured to intercept attackers at greater distances, reducing the number of aircraft reaching the fleet. Fighter direction improved as radar data was integrated more effectively into command and control processes. Although no system could guarantee complete interception, the probability of successful penetration declined steadily. Shipboard defenses evolved in parallel. Anti-aircraft coordination improved, ammunition supply was adjusted to reflect sustained engagement, and firing doctrines were refined to prioritize targets most likely to penetrate. Damage control procedures were standardized and rehearsed repeatedly. Crews learned to contain fires and flooding with speed and discipline, reducing the likelihood that a single hit would result in catastrophic loss. These adaptations did not eliminate casualties, but they altered the exchange ratio. Each kamikaze aircraft increasingly faced multiple interception opportunities before reaching a target. Successful hits required greater concentration or favorable conditions, both of which were increasingly difficult to achieve as Japanese coordination deteriorated. The attritional balance shifted further against Japan as the campaign progressed. Equally important was American organizational redundancy. Naval operations were designed to function despite losses. Task groups could absorb damage and continue operating. Air operations were distributed across multiple carriers and airfields. Logistics networks included buffers that mitigated temporary disruption. Kamikaze attacks inflicted damage, but they did not cascade into systemic failure. Japanese operational limitations compounded this trend.
As attacks continued, pilot training time shortened further, coordination declined, and aircraft quality worsened. Many late-war kamikaze sorties were launched with minimal navigation support and limited situational awareness. This reduced the likelihood of coordinated mass attack, increasing vulnerability to interception. Attrition thus became self-reinforcing. Each wave was less capable than the last. The absence of operational exploitation remained a critical weakness. Even when kamikaze attacks damaged or sank ships, there was no Japanese mechanism to capitalize on the moment. No follow-on airstrikes, no naval maneuver, and no ground action exploited temporary gaps. Tactical success remained isolated, failing to produce operational momentum. American forces repaired, regrouped, and resumed operations within established timelines. This dynamic exposed a fundamental asymmetry. American adaptation reduced the marginal effectiveness of each kamikaze attack, while Japanese persistence consumed irreplaceable resources. The defenders' learning curve moved upward as the attackers' capability declined. In strategic terms, this inversion ensured that time favored the United States, regardless of the bravery or intensity of individual attacks. The psychological dimension also evolved. Initial shock gave way to procedural response. While the threat remained lethal, it became normalized within operational planning. Crews adjusted expectations and routines, integrating the risk into daily operations. This normalization further reduced the strategic impact of kamikaze attacks, which relied in part on surprise and fear to amplify effect. By mid-1945, kamikaze operations had reached the limits of their influence. They could still kill and damage, but they could no longer alter plans, delay campaigns, or force reconsideration of objectives. American adaptation had converted a novel threat into a known quantity, dangerous, costly, but contained. Part 4 therefore demonstrates that kamikaze operations failed strategically, not only because of Japan's material weakness, but because of American systemic strength. The ability to learn faster than losses accumulated, to integrate technology with doctrine, and to distribute risk across a resilient force structure neutralized the strategic potential of suicide attacks. In the next part, the analysis will address the disconnect between kamikaze operations and strategic decision-making, examining why even severe casualties did not translate into altered Allied political or military choices, and why attrition alone proved insufficient to change the course of a war already decided by control of production, logistics, and time. The ultimate measure of strategic effectiveness is influence over decision-making. In this respect, kamikaze operations failed decisively. Despite inflicting significant casualties and damage, suicide attacks did not alter Allied political objectives, operational timelines, or strategic direction. This phase examines why attrition, however severe at the tactical level, proved insufficient to reshape American choices, and why kamikaze operations remained disconnected from the decisions they were intended to influence. Japanese planners hoped that cumulative losses would generate strategic hesitation. The underlying assumption was that American leadership would reassess the cost of continued advance if naval losses rose sharply enough.
This assumption misread both the structure of American decision-making and the context of an industrial war already approaching its conclusion. Attrition was factored into planning from the outset. It was not an unexpected variable, capable of redefining objectives on its own. American strategic decisions in the Pacific were shaped primarily by production capacity, logistical reach, and long-term feasibility, rather than by isolated loss events.
Naval losses, even when painful, were evaluated against replacement rates and operational reserves. A damaged or sunk ship was not assessed in isolation, but as a fraction of total available force and future output. Kamikaze attacks increased losses, but they did not threaten the continuity of American operations. This structural reality limited the leverage of attrition. The United States could replace ships, aircraft, and personnel faster than Japan could inflict losses. As long as replacement outpaced destruction, losses, even severe ones, did not force strategic reconsideration. Kamikaze operations never approached a level of sustained damage that exceeded American recovery capacity. Equally important was the absence of a clear decision threshold. Japanese strategy assumed that there existed a quantifiable level of loss that would compel the United States to alter course. In practice, no such threshold was defined. American leadership evaluated risk in relation to objectives already deemed essential. The capture of forward bases, defeat of Japanese forces, and termination of the war were prioritized over loss avoidance. Attrition was a cost to be managed, not a signal to withdraw. The political context further reduced kamikaze leverage. By late 1945, American public opinion was oriented toward decisive conclusion rather than compromise. Losses incurred in ongoing operations did not generate pressure for negotiation, but reinforced commitment to end the war definitively. Kamikaze attacks, while shocking, were interpreted as evidence of Japanese desperation rather than as proof of strategic strength. Operational planning reflected this outlook. Amphibious and naval operations continued according to schedule despite losses. Adjustments were made to tactics and force protection, but objectives remained unchanged. The ability to adapt without altering strategic goals was a defining characteristic of American response. Kamikaze attacks influenced how operations were conducted, not whether they were conducted. A critical weakness of kamikaze strategy was its isolation from diplomacy. Attrition alone, unaccompanied by credible political or military alternatives, could not create bargaining leverage. Japan lacked the capacity to signal a negotiated outcome that kamikaze operations might enable. Without a pathway from damage to settlement, losses inflicted remained strategically inert. The contrast with earlier phases of the war is instructive. In conflicts where attrition influences decision-making, it typically interacts with uncertainty, limited resources, or ambiguous objectives. By the final year of the Pacific War, these conditions no longer applied to the United States. Objectives were clear, resources abundant, and timelines flexible. Attrition, even when costly, did not create uncertainty about feasibility. Kamikaze operations also failed to disrupt the strategic sequencing of Allied plans. Naval and air operations adjusted locally, but the broader campaign structure remained intact. Preparations for future operations continued in parallel with ongoing combat. There was no cumulative delay effect capable of reshaping the war's trajectory. Attrition occurred within a system designed to absorb it. From an analytical perspective, this phase highlights a fundamental limitation of attrition-based strategies against an industrial opponent. Tactical loss does not equate to strategic influence unless it intersects with scarcity, political fragility, or operational uncertainty. Kamikaze operations intersected with none of these conditions. They imposed pain without leverage. Part 5 therefore clarifies why kamikaze operations, despite their visibility and lethality, failed to achieve their intended strategic purpose. They did not change what the United States sought to achieve, how it planned to achieve it,
or whether it believed achievement was possible.
Attrition increased cost, but cost alone did not determine strategy. In the final part, the analysis will synthesize these findings, assessing kamikaze operations as a whole and explaining why they remain a powerful symbol of sacrifice, while simultaneously representing a case of strategic failure rooted in structural imbalance rather than insufficient effort. The strategic failure of kamikaze operations becomes fully apparent when the entire campaign is assessed as a system rather than as a series of dramatic events. This final phase synthesizes the preceding analysis, explaining why kamikaze attacks, despite tactical effectiveness, institutional commitment, and extreme sacrifice, were structurally incapable of producing strategic success in the context of the Pacific War's final stage. At their core, kamikaze operations attempted to solve a strategic problem with a tactical instrument. Japan faced defeat, driven by loss of sea control, air superiority, and industrial parity. These were systemic disadvantages that determined the war's trajectory, regardless of individual engagements. Kamikaze attacks did not address these determinants. They targeted symptoms, exposed ships and personnel, without altering the underlying balance of power that sustained Allied operations. The concept assumed that sufficient pain could substitute for leverage. This assumption failed because pain alone does not compel change unless it intersects with vulnerability. The United States did not depend on a narrow margin of force, political consensus, or time-sensitive objectives that could be disrupted by attrition alone. American strategy was resilient precisely because it was built around redundancy, depth, and long-term endurance. Kamikaze attacks increased costs, but they did not threaten feasibility. Another structural limitation was irreversibility. Each kamikaze sortie consumed resources that could not be regenerated. Aircraft and pilots were expended permanently for incremental effect. The exchange ratio was therefore fixed against Japan from the outset. Even perfect execution could not reverse the trend because the strategy had no recovery mechanism. Attrition accumulated on one side only. This asymmetry was compounded by adaptation. American forces learned faster than Japanese forces could replace losses. Defensive systems improved, coordination tightened, and damage control became increasingly effective. As the attacker's capability declined, the defender's resilience increased. Over time, the strategic yield of kamikaze attacks diminished, even as their symbolic intensity grew. Institutionally, kamikaze operations reveal how strategies can persist after their strategic utility has expired. Once embedded within doctrine and ideology, the attacks became self-sustaining. They fulfilled internal requirements, demonstrating resistance, preserving honor, maintaining cohesion, even as they failed externally. In this sense, kamikaze operations were successful as an institutional response to defeat, but unsuccessful as a means of altering outcomes. The contrast between symbolism and effect is central. Kamikaze operations occupy a powerful place in historical memory because they represent absolute commitment. However, strategic effectiveness is not measured by sacrifice, but by influence over outcomes. The attacks inflicted damage, but they did not delay campaigns, change objectives, or produce negotiation leverage. Their visibility exceeded their impact. Kamikaze operations also illustrate a broader principle of modern warfare. When wars are decided by production, logistics, and control of operational systems, tactical extremity cannot compensate for strategic inferiority. Extreme methods may increase cost, but they cannot overcome structural imbalance. The Pacific War had reached this stage by the time kamikaze attacks were introduced. In final assessment, kamikaze operations failed strategically because they were employed in a context where strategic choice no longer existed. Japan could not trade loss for advantage, delay for leverage, or sacrifice for negotiation. The attacks were a rational response to defeat within a closed system. But rationality does not guarantee effectiveness when the underlying conditions are immutable.
Kamikaze operations therefore stand as a case study in the limits of attrition and sacrifice as tools of strategy. They demonstrate that determination, even when absolute, cannot substitute for control of systems that govern modern war. The failure was not moral, tactical, or psychological. It was structural. Their legacy is analytical rather than operational. Kamikaze attacks did not change the outcome of the war, but they clarify why it could not be changed by force alone at that stage. They mark the point at which Japan's ability to influence events through military action had ended, even as its willingness to fight had not. In this sense, kamikaze operations were not the last weapon of a viable strategy, but the final expression of a war already lost. The final significance of kamikaze operations lies in how they have been remembered, interpreted, and often misunderstood in post-war analysis. This phase examines the gap between historical perception and strategic reality, and why kamikaze attacks continue to be viewed as uniquely powerful despite their failure to alter outcomes. Understanding this gap is essential for separating symbolic impact from military effect. In post-war narratives, kamikaze operations are frequently framed as evidence of extraordinary desperation or fanatical resolve. This framing, while emotionally compelling, obscures the operational logic that produced them and exaggerates their strategic influence. The prominence of kamikaze attacks in historical memory reflects their dramatic nature rather than their actual role in shaping the war's end. American wartime reporting contributed unintentionally to this perception. Suicide attacks were highly visible, inflicted sudden casualties, and generated intense psychological stress among naval crews. These characteristics made them newsworthy and memorable. However, visibility does not equate to leverage. The attacks stood out precisely because they were extreme, not because they were decisive. Japanese post-war memory reinforced this distortion from a different direction. Kamikaze pilots were commemorated as symbols of sacrifice and national suffering. This memorialization served important cultural and political functions in the aftermath of defeat. Yet, it further detached the operations from sober strategic assessment. The emphasis on individual devotion displaced analysis of whether the strategy itself achieved its intended purpose. From a professional military perspective, kamikaze operations occupy a specific analytical category: tactics that maximize immediate effect while minimizing future flexibility. They offer short-term shock at the cost of long-term influence. This trade-off is rarely advantageous against an opponent capable of absorbing losses and adapting quickly. The Pacific War demonstrated this dynamic with unusual clarity. Kamikaze operations also illustrate the danger of conflating endurance with effectiveness. Japanese forces endured to the end, and their willingness to accept loss was unquestionable. However, endurance without leverage produces stalemate only when the opponent lacks alternatives. In this case, the United States possessed overwhelming alternatives in production, time, and strategic options. Endurance alone could not bridge that gap. The enduring fascination with kamikaze attacks often rests on a counterfactual assumption that greater numbers or earlier use might have changed the outcome. This assumption ignores the structural conditions that limited effectiveness from the outset.
Increased use would have accelerated depletion of Japan's remaining air power without creating new strategic effects. Earlier use would not have altered industrial imbalance or control of the sea. Analytically, kamikaze operations should therefore be understood as a terminal adaptation. They were not a path to victory, delayed or denied. They were a method of continuing conflict after victory had become unattainable. Their function was expressive rather than instrumental. They expressed resistance, resolve, and refusal to concede, but they did not create new options. This distinction matters because it informs how modern military planners assess extreme tactics. Kamikaze operations demonstrate that shock and sacrifice can coexist with strategic impotence. The presence of fear or loss does not guarantee influence over decision-making.
Without a mechanism to translate damage into constraint, even severe attacks remain tactically bounded. The lessons of kamikaze operations extend beyond their historical context. They caution against strategies that prioritize cost imposition without considering the opponent's capacity to absorb and adapt. They highlight the importance of targeting systems rather than symbols, and they underscore the limits of tactics divorced from operational and strategic integration. In final assessment, kamikaze operations failed strategically because they addressed the emotional and symbolic dimensions of war rather than its material and systemic foundations. They inflicted pain, but not paralysis. They demonstrated resolve, but not leverage. They prolonged suffering, but not influence. Part 7 completes the analytical arc of this study. Kamikaze operations remain among the most striking phenomena of the Second World War, but their significance lies not in what they nearly achieved, but in what they revealed. That in modern industrial war, strategy is decided by control of systems, not by extremity of sacrifice. Their legacy is therefore a warning.
When options collapse and institutions cling to symbolic action, violence may intensify even as influence disappears. Kamikaze operations stand as a final reminder that strategic failure is often not the result of insufficient effort, but of effort applied where it can no longer matter. The final assessment of kamikaze operations requires separating inevitability from intent. These attacks were not designed to win the war outright. They were designed to change the conditions under which the war would end. In this objective, they failed. The reasons for that failure illuminate the limits of military power when strategic conditions are already fixed. By the time kamikaze operations were fully institutionalized, Japan no longer possessed the means to alter the structural balance of the war. Control of the sea, air superiority, and industrial dominance rested decisively with the United States. These factors determined the pace, scale, and direction of operations, regardless of individual losses. Kamikaze attacks operated entirely within this framework. They could not escape it. The attacks succeeded in imposing cost, but cost alone was not decisive. American strategy was designed to absorb losses in pursuit of clearly defined objectives. Replacement capacity, logistical depth, and operational redundancy ensured the damage did not translate into paralysis. Kamikaze operations increased the price of advance, but they did not threaten its feasibility. In an industrial war, feasibility, not pain, determines outcome. A critical limitation was the absence of escalation potential. Kamikaze operations represented a maximum effort tactic from their inception. There was no higher level of intensity to reach once they were employed. As a result, Japan expended its remaining air power without creating the possibility of further leverage. The strategy front-loaded sacrifice while back-loading irrelevance. This dynamic contrasts sharply with strategies that retain optionality. Effective strategies preserve the ability to adapt, concentrate, or exploit success. Kamikaze operations eliminated these possibilities. Every sortie reduced future capacity. Every success narrowed remaining options. The strategy consumed itself faster than it consumed the enemy. Institutionally, kamikaze operations illustrate how organizations behave when defeat is acknowledged implicitly but denied explicitly. The attacks allowed Japan to continue fighting without confronting the implications of strategic collapse. They substituted symbolic resistance for practical influence. This substitution sustained internal cohesion, but it did not alter external realities. The American response underscores the decisive asymmetry. Allied forces adapted, absorbed losses, and continued operations without altering strategic objectives. Kamikaze attacks influenced tactics and defensive measures, but they did not shape policy. The attacks were accommodated rather than countered at the strategic level. This accommodation, rather than reaction, defined their failure. In hindsight, kamikaze operations appeared dramatic because they compressed sacrifice into visible moments.
Their immediacy and lethality created an enduring image of extremity. Yet extremity is not effectiveness. The attacks did not shorten the war, delay major operations, or force negotiation. They marked the final phase of Japanese military action, not a turning point. The enduring lesson is structural. When war is decided by systems, production, logistics, control of movement, tactics that ignore those systems cannot succeed strategically. Kamikaze operations targeted platforms, not processes. They destroyed ships, but not shipbuilding. They killed crews, but not replacement pipelines. They threatened operations, but not strategy. In final analysis, kamikaze operations failed because they attempted to reverse an irreversible condition. They were applied after strategic choice had vanished.
At that stage, no level of sacrifice could restore leverage. The attacks were a rational response within a closed system, but rational responses can still be ineffective when constraints are absolute. Kamikaze operations therefore conclude the Pacific Air War not as a viable strategy, but as a boundary case. They define the outer limit of what attrition and sacrifice can achieve when opposing an industrial power with strategic depth. They demonstrate that determination, even when total, cannot substitute for control of the systems that govern modern war. Their historical significance lies in this clarity. Kamikaze operations did not fail because they lacked commitment or courage. They failed because the war had already moved beyond the point where such qualities could influence its direction.